And that also has a pointer on it?
No, it's, yes, I think it's here. It's halfway.
Oh, okay. Okay, good morning. Can you hear me? Of course, I could say raise your hands if you hear me, but then those who don't hear me won't raise their hands because they didn't hear me. Okay. What we're going to talk about now is the use of green manure cover crops to fertilize the soil and to end droughts. What I've found the last year or two is that we have had some tremendous droughts across the Sahel and down the east coast of Africa, and then back across through Mozambique, Malawi, Namibia, and so forth. And farmers are finally realizing that this isn't just a period of more droughts that then is going to correct itself, you know, in a sort of a wavy pattern. What's happening is, from your perspective, the droughts are getting worse and worse, productivity is going down, and it's just going to keep going that way. Because the last few years we've had some of the worst droughts we've had in generations. And in fact, that's what's going to happen. Things are going to get worse and worse and worse, in large part because of soil degradation. Now, why is that happening? I started coming to Africa in about the 60s. At that time, soil fertility was really quite good. And the interesting thing is that it had been good for about 2,000 years. And then all of a sudden something changed. I mean, basically smallholder farmers, by using fallowing, or what some people call slash and burn agriculture, by letting the forest grow for 15 years or so, they had kept the soil fertile for 2,000 years. So what has happened just in the last 30 years? What's happened is that because of population increase, the amount of soil each farmer has is less and less. Most smallholder farmers now have less than 2 hectares of land across Africa. What that means is you can't fallow anymore. If you have 2 hectares and you leave 3/4 of it in forest, you're not going to have enough land left to feed your family. So gradually, since the 1980s, the fallowing period has dropped from 15 years to 10 years to 8 years to 4 years. Now a few people will still fallow for 2 years, but how much does a tree grow in 2 years? You're not really accomplishing much. The vast majority of farmers in sub-Saharan Africa, smallholder farmers, can no longer fallow. Fallowing is in its death throes. And what does that mean? That means the organic matter content of the soil has dropped through the floor. In the 1970s and 80s, most smallholder farmers had maybe 3, 4, 5% organic matter. Now it's down in most cases to less than 1%. Okay? That's a tremendous difference in natural soil fertility. But what that also means is that when your soil has so little organic matter, it becomes, if it's a clay soil or has very much clay at all, it becomes hard as a rock. When I ask farmers, well, how deep does your soil get wet after a really good rain? You know, if it rains for 3 or 4 hours, it really comes down. And, you know, for 3 or 4 hours, how deep does your soil get wet? And they'll say, well, you know, it's not like it used to be because now it only gets wet about that deep. Okay? And this is, I've asked that question all the way from Mali to Kenya and on down to southern Mozambique. And the same thing is happening everywhere. In fact, on the coast of Mozambique, the coastal areas where the population is greater, so people had to stop fallowing, had to start reducing their fallowing 50 years ago instead of 30 years ago. They can't grow maize anymore, they can't grow sorghum, they can't grow millet. All they're growing is cassava and a little bit of cowpeas. And as a result, the child stunting rate, we were looking at figures on malnutrition this morning, The child stunting rate is above 70%. I mean, 70% is what the government admits to, and in fact, it's worse. Rural child stunting rate is 70 to 80%. That means we're basically losing the intelligence of the next generation of children. Okay? That's going to be the future here and in the rest of Africa, in at least the drought-prone areas of Africa. Okay? We're seeing the future there because they've had 20 more years since they started reducing their fallowing. We really need to do something about it. Not only is this happening, well, and what it's causing is another factor, and that is that before 2010, I've gone back and looked at the statistics. Before 2010, even the worst droughts in Africa left maybe 60 to 80 and sometimes up to 10 million, 6 to 8 and sometimes up to 10 million people in need of food aid or dependent on food aid. 2.5 years ago, the United Nations declared a drought in Africa. Now this included Yemen, but they were talking about 20 million people in need of food aid. We don't know for sure what this year is like, but several people, some of the best experts, are estimating that maybe 30 million people are totally dependent on food aid this year. Okay? Now, the world, the food aid organizations don't have enough food to go on giving out that much food, and the problem is probably going to get worse. Furthermore, when I was in southern Mozambique about 2 months ago, I was working in an area where they had had serious droughts for 4 solid years. They'd sold most of their animals and, were figuring that, well, next was going to be their kids that died. Finally, in January of this year, the World Food Program started giving them food. But when the cyclone came along in about, what was it, April or something, May? When the cyclone hit central Mozambique, the World Food Program had so little surplus food that they had to stop giving these people who hadn't had a decent harvest in 4 years any food at all so they could give it to the victims of the cyclone. We're in a situation where we're going to see tremendous suffering in the near future if we don't do something about it. Okay? So the big question here is, how do you increase the organic matter content of the soil? Now, for small vegetable gardens and for some fruit trees, a few things like that, some very high value crops, you can use or buy animal manure or compost. But for a hectare of land, it would take you approximately 4 or 5 months to make compost to even just maintain the soil fertility on it. Okay? The amount of animal manure would be more animal manure than any 5 or 10 smallholder farmers have. We can't depend on those means of doing it. The only way that we can economically, given the resources of smallholder farmers, is use green manure cover crops. And maybe what Tim said, we're going to start trying that. We hope we can do it on a huge scale quickly, but in the meantime, the one widely proven way of dealing with low levels of organic matter in the soil is green manure cover crops. The only way. And it may be the only way we can prevent a huge, devastating disaster here in drought-prone Africa. Okay, the photo here at the beginning of my presentation is a farmer. Now he's from Honduras. I worked in Central America for 30 years before I came to Africa, actually almost 40 years. And there are several things about this photo you should notice. First of all, he's showing us one small ear in his left hand and 2 large ears in his right hand. That's the change that's the difference of what he used to produce 6 or 8 years ago and what he produces now on each stalk of maize. Okay, so he's very close to tripled his maize production. You can see behind him the reason why. There's a green manure cover crop. There's a legume that's growing up his maize. Okay? Now look at the color of the soil. This wasn't black like that 10 years before. I know this farmer. I knew him well. He lived 5 kilometers from my home. And that soil has become black because of all the organic matter in it. That's a fertile soil. Okay? But even more interesting for me, that's his son over there sitting on the terrace that's been formed by the grass barrier that you can see behind our farmer. He's actually sitting on the soil that the grass barrier has stopped coming down the hill, okay, which is quite a bit. But the interesting thing is that he's still in the village. In Honduras, like in most of Africa, young fellas go to the city because they know there's no future out in the village. But this fellow knows that that field is producing very well and is producing better each year and is going to produce that way for a long time. So he's planning on staying out in the village. Here in Africa right now, the last statistic I saw was that the average smallholder farmer is 54 years old. A whole generation of youth have gone to the cities. And that's because they see that the future of their situation is dire. They understand very clearly that with production going down each year, there isn't a whole lot of future out in the villages. Okay? And with the droughts, even more so. Okay, what is the cause of the droughts? I've already explained that to some extent. Climate change is part of it. That's what makes the rain less predictable and concentrates the rain in a few events so that it makes it more and more difficult for farmers to grow crops because you have long drought periods between the rain. But in fact, that's probably only 20 to 30% of the problem. It's important. I'm not denying climate change. But it's not most of the problem. Most of the problem is, in fact, what I've already said, the reduction in organic matter in the soil and therefore the reduction in rainwater infiltration. When the soil organic matter content takes a dive like it has, I said it had gone from about 4 to 5% down to less than 1%, that means the rainwater infiltration rate, the amount of water that actually goes into the soil when it rains, is greatly reduced. Some scientific studies in Malawi have shown that since the 1980s, the rainwater infiltration rate has gone from about 60%, in other words, 60% of the water going into the soil, down to somewhere between 10 and 20%. In other words, with the same amount of rain, farmers are getting 1/3 as much water in their soil as they did 30 years ago. Okay? And the reason I usually say that the problem of soils is 80% of the problem, because in areas where the green manure cover crops have had long enough, and it takes about 6 years, have long enough to completely resist the droughts or resist the droughts well, farmers are getting about 3 times the maize they used to get. Instead of 1 ton per hectare, they're getting close to 3 tons per hectare. But what's most interesting is that in the bad years, when there's a real bad drought, they get about 80% of that. In other words, in a good year, they'll get 3 tons. In a bad year, they'll get 2.5 tons. So that means that 20% of the reduction is due to the rains. 80% of the reduction in yields that farmers are suffering now because of droughts is in fact due to the situation of the soil. Okay? Because once you fix up the soil, you only lose 20% of your harvests when there's a bad drought. compared to the good years. So that means that 80% of the problem is in our soil. Now, there's a in one sense, this is bad news, and in another sense, it's good news. The bad news is that when droughts are caused by the soil, they don't automatically terminate. They don't self-terminate. The droughts we used to have in the 60s and 70s and so forth, you know, after a certain period of drought, it would start raining again, and the drought was over. The drought ended itself. It self-terminated. Now, it's going to get worse and worse and worse, okay, unless we do something about it. The good news is that we couldn't do anything about the rain, or at least it was very difficult for farmers to change the rain. I know some farmers in Bolivia used to send explosives up into the air and have them go off, and they thought maybe that would help it rain more. Maybe it did, I don't know, but not very much. But there's basically very little we can do about the rainfall. There's a lot we can do about the soil. That's the good news, okay? So now the power to change the situation is in our hands. It's no longer up in the sky somewhere where we can't do anything about it. Okay, and here are some figures to back up what I said a little earlier. It takes about 20 to 25 tons per hectare. Is this too? Oh, okay. Okay, it takes about 20 to 25 tons per hectare of green or of organic matter, of moist organic matter, to improve our soils. That's an awful lot of organic matter. That I have never in my life seen a farmer that applied 20 tons of compost in 1 year, okay? Nor have I ever seen a farmer that had a smallholder farmer that had that much animal manure, okay? So that's the bad news. The good news is that green manure cover crops, many of them can supply 30, 40, 50 tons, even 60 tons of organic matter. Now we're talking green weight, not dry weight, but a lot of green manure cover crops can definitely supply this much and more, which means they can dramatically increase our soil fertility and increase the amount of organic matter in the soil, okay? And like it says here, have you ever seen a farmer produce even 10 tons of compost in 1 year? I've asked all sorts of groups, and once in a while one person raises his or her hand. But that is extremely rare. And that's only half what it takes to maintain your soil fertility, not to increase it. Okay, so what are these things I keep calling green manure cover crops? What do I mean by that? We aren't talking about green manures in the traditional sense, or in the sense that is in the textbooks that any of you agronomists read. They won't talk about green manure cover crops. I don't think there's a textbook written yet that has the term green manure cover crops, even though we've been using them for 30 years. Well, 35 years now. Okay, green manure cover crops are plants, usually a legume, whether it is a tree, a bush, a vine, a crawler, or a waterborne plant that farmers use, among other reasons, to increase soil fertility, control weeds, or overcome droughts. Okay, they can do all these three things. Now, what you've learned in your textbooks is that you grow a green manure as a monocrop at the beginning of the season, then you cut it down at 50% flowering stage, and you bury it. Okay, that's what your textbook said. Well, for that method of using green manure cover crops, which was used all over Europe and the United States until about the Second World War, when fertilizers became common, completely failed in developing countries. Okay, they tried using green manures, the colonists tried using green manures all over Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and they failed. Okay, why? They didn't adapt them to the situation of smallholder farmers. First of all, farmers prefer green manure cover crops that provide food. How many farmers are going to plant some beans of some kind that are edible, or cowpeas, or any one of, we have over 100 species of green manure cover crops right now, not including the trees. Okay, how many farmers are going to plant any of these that are edible and then cut them down just as they're flowering? Not very many. I mean, that would be ridiculous. The plants are worth more as producers of beans and peas than they are as ways of making your soil more fertile. Okay? How many people are going to plant these things as a monocrop at the beginning of the season and not plant their edible crops until a month and a half or 2 months after the rain started? I don't think there's a farmer out there. I mean, that would be ridiculous. They'd lose their crops because the dry season would start before they could harvest hardly anything. Okay? Now, let's turn all this material under the soil. We've got 40 tons of organic matter on top of the soil, and we're going to turn it under with a hoe. That would take about 3 months. If you have 2 hectares, it would take 6 months. You wouldn't even have time to do it, even if you spent your whole dry season turning stuff under with your hoe. No way farmers are going to do that. Okay? So we're not talking about green manures in the traditional sense. Okay, now, back in the 70s, 60s and 70s, we had no idea what organic matter could do. This is a smallholder farmer experiment. We didn't even think to try it. One of the beauties of teaching farmers to experiment is that they also teach us a whole lot of things as a result of their experimentation. So Conrado Sawalha, a farmer in Honduras, I'll never forget him, decided he was going to find out if all this stuff we were saying about organic matter was really true. And in those days, we had no idea what was really true. But we were saying, well, you ought to try using some organic matter. It'll fertilize your soil a little bit. So he made 16 compost heaps and piled that compost into the maize starting from here and going that direction, okay? And as you can see, there's some beautiful maize there, okay? But that same day, using the same seed, he also planted one row here that's not looking too good, and another row here that is about ankle high and produced 0 grain. Okay? That was all planted the same day with the same seed. The only difference is that here he turned over the soil and put compost in it. Lots and lots and lots of compost. Okay? Now, since that time, since the time that I shot this photo, we have been working with green manure cover crops. I've worked with them personally in about 50 different countries. Okay? We have seen that this is possible. This sort of increase is possible. There was no chemical fertilizer applied there or anything. Even more dramatically, and something I would have, even 6 years ago, I wouldn't have believed this. This is a field in Madagascar. Once again, a woman owner of the field. You can see she's got cowpeas planted there with her maize. The maize is planted very far apart, and in spite of that, it's not doing well. The leaves are all rolled up. That's because of drought. Okay? That field, if she's lucky, will produce 400 or 500 kilos per hectare. Okay? If she's lucky. Now, if you look at the back right, whoops, I'm having a hard time with this thing. If you look at the back right, back here, you'll see that there's an area that's quite green. Okay? That's this field. Okay? You can see, once again, the cowpeas on the ground. You can see the maize. It's planted much closer together, and it's doing very well, thank you. If you look at the cloud up here, you'll see that same cloud over here. Okay, you can see it's the same shape. These two photos were taken the same day in the same field. The only difference is that in this case, she had planted that cowpea. It's a 9-month cowpea, which is very important. But she planted that 9-month cowpea for 6 years along with her maize. Okay, so she had no reduction of maize yields at any time, but now she's producing in good years 3 times what she used to produce. In bad years, she's producing 2.5 tons instead of virtually 0. Okay? Entirely because of the green manure cover crop. Okay, what are the advantages of green manure cover crops? First of all, they can triple present yields of basic grains. I've already mentioned that. These same plants can produce a large quantity of additional food rich in proteins. We always try to use, when we can, legumes that will produce high protein food because we are concerned about nutrition. We definitely want a nutrition relevant agriculture. 3, some of these green manures also reduce the hunger season or totally end it. 4, they can also help reduce the labor needed to control weeds because some of them do a very good job of covering the soil. We'll see a few photos in a little bit. 5th, they can reduce the impact of droughts by up to 80%. 6th, they can sequester carbon in the soil long term at a rate up to 4 tons per hectare per year. Now that's a lot of carbon, and that's talking about long-term sequestration. The fact of the matter is that if all, and I could go into the arithmetic, but I won't, but if all the world's farmers and ranchers sequestered as much carbon as these smallholder farmers are here in Africa, and there are farmers that are already doing it. I've just shown you some pictures of them. If all the farmers and ranchers in the world would sequester that much carbon in their soils, 80% of all the carbon that needs to be sequestered in the soil by the year 2100, according to the Paris Accords, would be sequestered in the soil by the year 2100 by the world's farmers and ranchers. There's a lot of news out these days that, well, we aren't sure we can do that much about global warming, so we're going to have to adapt. That's nonsense. If we really work at it, we can do it. And we're going to start here in Africa. And I hope Africa is going to show the world how carbon can be sequestered very, very cheaply in very large quantities. They can go a long way toward very cheaply protecting our crops from the impact of global warming. This is partly because some of the green manures, as I said, are trees, so we can reduce the heat on our crops just by how much we prune the trees. And furthermore, these trees and the green manure cover crops increase the water holding capacity of the soil. They decrease the evaporation and transpiration rates in the shade, and therefore our soil stays moist a lot longer. So both the variable rainfall and the increased heat that are caused by global warming can be solved by these plants at a very, very, very low cost, while at the same time people are doubling and tripling their food production. Okay, they can reduce overall cost by eliminating and reducing weeding labor, by eliminating or reducing tillage, and by producing firewood right in farmers' fields. By the way, those of you who are worried about the amount of work women have to do here in Africa, I worry about it too. But you can see that both weeding, which is at least weeding of food crops, is almost always women's work, almost anywhere in sub-Saharan Africa, and firewood collection is also women's work. Both of those can be reduced tremendously by these crops. In fact, when you're promoting these crops in a village, make sure there's women in attendance, because they will be much more interested in this sometimes than the men, precisely because they will not only have more food to feed their children, but they will be working less to get it. Okay, another little fiction that our textbooks have taught us. Can anybody tell me what this picture is? What's in my hands there? What is that? Well, some of you know. You never saw a picture like this in your textbooks, I'll bet. Okay, those are nodules from one mucuna plant. okay? Now in the textbooks, they'll show you a root going across the picture, and they'll show you one little nodule that's about 1 millimeter in diameter, and then an inch along the root they'll show you another one, and then another one. That's what fertilizer companies want you to believe is the best you can do with nodules and with nitrogen fixing. In fact, once again, it's a total lie. Now, this particular mucuna plant, the farmers, again, this is a farmer experiment. We learn a lot from farmers' experiments. They had planted one mucuna plant in a field that had had mucuna for 6 or 7 years, so it had lots of rhizobia. And they cleared an area 3 meters around on all sides so that there wouldn't be any competition, and this is what they got. In a regular field, this won't happen. But you will get many, many, many more nodules than they ever showed you in a textbook. Okay? By the way, I once went to the Mann Library at Cornell University, which is one of the best agricultural libraries in the entire United States. I found 15 beginning textbooks, beginning college textbooks on soils, and every one of those 15 textbooks had at least one author, or had either the author or one co-author who was an active employee of a fertilizer company. Okay? Don't think that what you're getting from textbooks is an accurate statement about things like green manure cover crops, because these are the fertilizer company's worst fear. It's the worst news in the world is that farmers here in Africa can triple their agricultural production and never put a drop of fertilizer on the soil. Okay? Anyway, when these green manure cover crops can fix anywhere from 60 to 80 to 120 to 240 or even 400 kilos of nitrogen per hectare, that means that those higher figures, 240 and 400, are figures those are quantities of nitrogen that no farmer in the United States would ever apply to his soil. Okay? It's way higher than anything we need. For most crops, for most maize crops right now here in Africa, you need about 40 or 50 tons. 40 or 50 kilos of nitrogen per hectare. And like I said, these crops go from 60 to 400 kilos of nitrogen per hectare. They're producing way more nitrogen than we need. Okay? That's why we can leave them on top of the soil instead of putting them under. Sure, we'll lose a little bit of nitrogen. But what's the problem if we're producing 120 kilos of nitrogen? If we lose 20 or 30 kilos, we've still got 3 times as much as we need. Okay? Okay, now there are some serious disadvantages to green manure cover crops, and these tell us what we have to do to make them successful. In other words, these are extremely important, the disadvantages, so that we understand them and we overcome these problems when and where they exist. The first one, they occupy space in our fields. Okay, a lot of people think that, well, what we ought to do then is just rotate them with our regular crops. The problem with that is that means you're only growing half as much maize as you would normally. Okay, if maize is your main crop. If cassava is your main crop, then you're only growing cassava on half your field because the other half is got your green manure. Right off the bat, farmers are going to say, no way. Okay, in the vast majority of cases, we intercrop these legumes with our main crops. Okay, and that takes a little bit, like for instance, we can't use normal mucuna because it climbs and it covers your maize and kills it. So you know, I showed you several photos of mucuna, but that's only because I haven't taken many photos the last 30 years because I was too busy learning from the farmers. If I'm sitting there taking photos, I'm not listening to the farmers. But we don't use mucuna much anymore, except if it's a bushy type of mucuna, which is fairly rare, but you can get it. We also prefer to use green manure cover crops that produce food. Mucuna seeds you can't produce without causing a tremendous amount of labor on the part of the people who are cooking our food. Okay, so we intercrop the green manures with our regular crops. That means, for instance, that we've had a real hard time finding green manures for rice because it's too short. We've had a hard time finding green manure cover crops that won't take a certain amount of shade, because then we can't intercrop them with maize. And then the other time we can grow green manure cover crops is as a rotation, but during the dry season. Some green manure cover crops in high rainfall areas will make it through the dry season because there's a little bit of rain and they get some rain at the beginning. We've just discovered recently, because of what farmers are doing in a huge area between Dodoma and Mwanza in Tanzania, they're using chickpeas. Now, this is a species we hadn't paid much attention to. We thought it was only a high altitude green manure, but we're going to pay a lot of attention to it now, because farmers are growing it during the dry season in an area that only has 400 millimeters of rain, and at an elevation of just over 500 or 600 meters in elevation. So we're really going to look at this. We're going to start researching this thing really fast now, because this could be a real answer to a lot of problems with green manures. The other nice thing is that during the dry season, cattle won't eat it. It's the only green manure cover crop I know that humans can eat, but cattle won't, because it has some small spines on the plant and the cattle won't touch it. So but one of the things we need to do is find a situation in which we can grow the green manure and it's not affecting our regular crops. We can still grow just as much maize, just as much beans, just as much groundnuts or whatever else we're growing, and at the same time grow our green manure cover crops, okay? Excuse me. Most of them only show visible results. Most green manure cover crops only show visible results during the second year. And factors such as resistant to drought may take up to 5 or 6 years. People have to have patience. Now, what we do oftentimes, for instance, Glyricidea is one of the trees we use a lot. And so we bring people Glyricidea leaves, and we tell them to try them out by putting them on their vegetables early in the growth of their tomatoes or peppers or whatever else they're growing. And all of a sudden, they will have tomatoes that are like that, and onions that are like that, and they will realize, my gosh, this is incredible fertilizer. In fact, Glyricidea leaves, kilo for kilo, are just as good at fertilizing the soil as cow manure. Okay? So what we do to overcome this problem is to show people, illustrate to people, do little experiments where we show them how much these leaves are capable of fertilizing their crops, and then they will be very happy to wait for a year to begin seeing the results. Third, they can be affected by difficult growing conditions. Smallholder farmers, almost by definition, often have the worst soils and the worst situations in Africa. So we have to be ready to deal with bad situations. Right now, the soils in most of drought-prone Africa, and this I'm talking about all the way across the Sahel and in huge areas down eastern Africa and across southern Africa, a lot of those soils are now very, very in poor shape. They have almost no organic matter. And so we have to go in first. We can't grow lablab, for instance, which you know, in northern Tanzania and much of Kenya has a wonderful price in the market, and furthermore, a lot of people like to eat it once they learn how to cook it. And it's, in fact, a plant that is native to East Africa. And it's far more nutritious than the common beans that we now eat that were brought from Europe. The Europeans thought everything in Europe was better than everything in Africa, so they in many cases, forced farmers to quit growing lablab and grow common beans, but in fact, lablab has about 50% more protein than the common beans we eat, okay? So, but lablab won't grow in the soils the way they are now. So what we have to do is we have to grow jack bean for a couple of years, which doesn't produce a good food. And then after a couple of years, with jack bean, the soil will be good enough so lablab will grow. But anyway, we have to overcome this problem that right now, almost everywhere across drought-prone Africa, our soils are in very bad shape, and some of these legumes aren't going to grow in that soil. So in many, many cases, all over Tanzania now, we're starting out with jack bean, and farmers are really happy with it. Even this last year, with the terrible drought we had in Tanzania, which is one of the worst people have ever seen, the jack bean was nice and green 3 months into the usual dry season. I mean, it went through what was supposed to be the wet season, and then a good part of the dry season, it was still green. And boy, I tell you, people were impressed. In some cases, it is difficult to have green leaves available when the next season starts. Okay, if you don't remember anything else I say today, remember this: the golden rule of green manure cover crops. You have to have green leaves on the soil at the time you plant your next crop. Okay? If you cut a plant down 6 months before the next rainy season comes, it's going to have almost no nitrogen left by the time you plant your next crop. The effect on the growing of those plants is going to be virtually nothing. Okay? So you have to have green manure cover crops that will grow through the dry season and still have green leaves at the beginning of the wet season. Okay? And we'll talk the specifics about how to grow each one of these species. We'll talk about this afternoon in my next talk. Okay? Right now what we're dealing with is sort of the general principles that work in highlands, lowlands, anywhere you want to plant them. Then this afternoon we'll start looking at species that are particularly good for high altitudes. Okay, free grazing animals may cause serious losses during the dry season. This is a problem in many, many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, but it is one that we're learning to overcome, in part by, for instance, using Glycidia, which is a tree, so within 1 year of planting it, it's way up above where the cattle can reach. So the first year we have to protect it. After that, we don't have to worry because the cattle can't reach it. All we do is cut down a few branches and feed them each day, and that's one of the tremendous advantages of Glycidia, is that it is a wonderful cattle feed. Another possibility is that we have now found, after 30 years of looking, I've found a tree that works wonderfully for making live fences. It's called the monkey thorn tree. It's Acacia galpini. It's one of the acacias. It takes 1 kilo of seeds to plant a whole kilometer of fence, and a kilo costs about $1.50. So you can put all the fencing you want on a smallholder farmer's plot, and it'll cost them about $1.50 US dollar. The second thing is it's very narrow. It doesn't take up a lot of space in your field. If you're a small farmer with very, very little land, it's not going to take up a meter and a half of land like many of our live fences. Third, in 1 year, it's this high and is strong enough to keep cattle out. Okay? It'll keep cattle, goats, even dogs and sheep out of a field. And probably the best thing yet is that it will last 80 to 100 years. You don't have to rebuild that fence every year. All you have to do is prune it. So we're finding ways of dealing with this problem of free roaming cattle. Okay. There's a lot more about this. I don't very often do this, but if you're really interested in growing green manure cover crops, it would probably be worthwhile getting this book. Because there are a lot of other details. It goes into each species we use, of about 35 of the more important species. Like I said, there's about 100 species being used around the world, but there are about 35 that could possibly be used here in Africa under different situations. Okay, so we have about 2 minutes for questions. Does anybody have any sort of general questions right now? And I will deal more with questions this afternoon during my talk. But if there are 3 or 4 questions right now, yeah, in the back. I am not equipped with a laboratory so that I can analyze this. And I would guess that with most annual legumes, that's probably the case. If you take off all the seeds, you're not going to have much nitrogen left in your soil. But remember, we can lose part of the nitrogen and still have more than we need for our crops. And we are almost entirely using, because of the problem of having green leaves on the soil at the beginning of the following season, we're almost entirely using perennials. Now, if a perennial, I mean, I don't know whether they just didn't experiment with perennials in the States or they didn't want to because that might prove them wrong, but a perennial, if it lost all its nitrogen the minute you took all the seeds off, would be dead. Without nitrogen, a plant is dead. So, you know, those perennials have to have some. I do know in the case of mucuna, which we got analyzed years ago, mucuna actually has more nitrogen in the plant 4 or 5 months after the plant has gone to seed than it does when it goes to seed. So, you know, we know in that case it's totally wrong, and that's an annual. But it's just logical that perennial grain legumes would have to have a lot of nitrogen in them to keep growing the rest of their lives. And furthermore, we have an awful lot of evidence from millions of farmers around the world, literally millions, that these green manures are improving the soil and are increasing the nitrogen content of our soils, even when people harvest the seeds. Yeah. By the way, you might be surprised by this, but if you add up just the systems I mentioned in my book, I mentioned about 120 different systems that are, most of them developed by smallholder farmers, some of them developed by agronomists and spread among smallholder farmers. But if you add up the total number of farmers that are using those systems, it comes out to somewhere between 10 and 20 million people. Somewhere between 10 and 20 million smallholder farmers around the world are using green manure cover crops as we speak. This is not something that's untested. It's not something that's new. It's not something that's just now coming out of the laboratory. It's something that's been around for well over 1,000 years. Okay? And smallholder farmers are at the forefront of the whole movement. Okay? Yeah. Speak up and I'll hear you.
Yeah. My voice is a little bit weak.
Okay, okay.
It's better to speak. Yeah, my name is Roland Bunch. I'm from Ethiopia. So I have really one concern. You know, the soil scientists, they say eating organic matters is a solution for land degradation or food security. And the crop people, they say, oh, our varieties are really the one to solve all smallholder farmers. And the livestock people, they say the same. So how can we really systematically and holistically think and address the issues of the smallholder farmers in Africa?
Now, what was the problem? Just that they don't have enough land to grow the green manures? Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying we, all of us, from different disciplines, we are advertising or saying our technologies are the best. But how can we really holistically think and address the issues of the smallholder farmers in Africa or other developing countries? Now you are telling us that cover crops, green mining crops are really the solutions to address land degradation or climate change related issues. So I think we need to really think in a holistic manner, relating crops, livestock, natural resource management to address holistically different issues.
Okay.
And I want to get your
Yeah, this is a little bit of a complicated issue, but let me attack it. First of all, if we want farmers to grow all sorts of different things, we better make sure, first of all, they have enough maize to eat throughout the year. In Central America, the same thing happens as here. As long as farmers don't have enough maize to eat the whole year, they're very reluctant to plant anything else and have even less maize. What we found in Central America, and it proved very, very successful, is that the best way to get people to diversify from maize is to teach them how to grow maize better. In other words, what would happen in Honduras, for instance, the first year they'd experiment on a small scale, they'd get a really good crop, but on a very small scale. The next year they'd do that on most of their field. They'd get 3 times the maize they used to get, and so, you know, I'd go to their homes and the kitchen would be piled high with maize. You could hardly get to the stove, okay, because they didn't have anywhere else to store so much maize. Okay, the third year, what would happen? They'd come knocking on our door, if they weren't already involved in the program, and they'd say, look, you know, this next year I'm only going to plant half of my land in maize because that's all I need to eat. I don't have to have all that extra maize, and besides, maize doesn't get a good price in the market. It's a lousy cash crop. So I'm only going to plant about half of my field in maize. What else should I plant to make some money? I'd like to have some money for school kids, for you know, school uniforms and books and medicines, and you know, tell me about a couple of cash crops I could plant. So the best way to get people to diversify is to increase their maize production. Okay? The second thing is, almost anything you want to grow is going to grow better with these green manure cover crops. I talked about onions that big. I use that illustration because some of the women in Mali were telling me that, you know, they'd never seen onions that big until they started using green manure cover crops. And, you know, after 2 or 3 years, you know, the onions that they used to grow like this, the same variety, same seed, same everything, was now producing onions like this, you know. And not staying in the soil a long time, so the inside got pithy and so forth. They had good quality onions that were that big around. In Honduras, when we got onions like that big, we had to cut them in half to show the women that there wasn't hollow inside. It was a good onion. It just was growing in better soil. So another thing is, I mean, I definitely believe in agriculture whose purpose is to increase nutritional well-being, and we don't. Well, in the project I'm working in now, we don't worry about all those other factors that we saw this morning, but we do worry about producing enough food and enough variety of food so that people have a good diet. Now, the leaves of both cowpeas and lablab beans are what I consider a nutritionist's dream, because here you have first of all, a food that, okay, we're talking about people that all grow maize or sorghum or millet or cassava or something, so you know, they've taken care of, or largely take care of, the calories. Well, that's not really true, but we'll have calories if we do the other things I'm talking about. We'll have enough. But the point is that with these 2 legumes I've told you about, that I've mentioned, cowpeas and lablab beans, they can eat the leaves. The leaves of the lablab have 21% protein, which means they're more nutritious than the beans that we eat, the grain that we eat, not the leaves, the grain. The leaves of the lablab are more nutritious than the grain that we eat when we eat beans, okay? In terms of protein, they have a higher level of protein. Furthermore, they're dark green leaves, so they also have vitamins and minerals. Furthermore, you can dry them and store them in fertilizer sacks and keep them for a whole year, which means this is a very high source of proteins, vitamins, and minerals that will store all year long, so you can eat them any time of the year you want. And furthermore, they're largely free because they're a byproduct of growing the grain. You know? So tell me how many almost free foods we can produce here in Africa cheaply that are high in protein, vitamins, and minerals that cost almost nothing and that you can have available all year long. I mean, that's a nutritionist's dream, right? Yeah. Do we still have time for another question?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Merci pour la parole. J'aurais besoin de quelqu'un qui pourra m'interpréter.
Maybe we need a translator for that. Can you repeat the question?
J'étais en train de vous demander si les jack beans peut-il réduire les attaques des plantes par les insectes?
Ah, yeah, okay, I got it. Oh, well, translate for everybody else. Yeah, translate for everybody else. I speak Spanish, so yeah, I can understand French fairly well.
Maybe you understand it.
Yeah,
Can you
yeah.
translate the question first?
Yeah, yeah. He's asking if these green manure cover crops will also reduce the destruction of our crops by pests, right? By insect pests. Okay. Yes and no. I mean, there are some insects we still haven't figured out how to control this way, but there are quite a few that yes. For instance, well, now these aren't insect pests, these are weeds, but striga, when you increase the organic matter content in your soil, striga will disappear automatically. Striga only grows in a poor soil with low organic matter content. For instance, if you remember or you want to ask your father or grandfather, who was a farmer probably, what did he do after he'd fallowed, or what was the situation in his field after he'd fallowed it for 15 years? And he, burned it and everything and cut it down and was ready to plant the first year. He'd say, no, there wasn't any striga there. The striga didn't come till later. Okay? That's the same thing about plowing. Most farmers here in Africa, when they were still fallowing their soil, the first year after they fallowed, they didn't plow. There was no need. The soil was so soft. Well, that's what will happen with green manure cover crops. It'll become so soft after 3 or 4 years that we don't need to plow anymore. So you save a whole lot of work. Now, in terms of insects, let's look at the fall armyworm. Most of you have heard of fall armyworm? Raise your hands. Who's heard of fall armyworm? Okay, well, most of you aren't getting out into the field very much. Okay, farmers in Africa right now are suffering from fall armyworm to a huge extent. It's because it came into Africa just 4 or 5 years ago, something like that, from Central America. So it's really devastated some areas. If you intercrop your maize, and by the way, this insect only attacks maize, sorghum, and millet, pretty much. If you intercrop your maize, that will reduce the infestation of fall armyworm by about 50%. Because the females that are looking for some way to where to lay their eggs, they fly over, and they're smelling, when they smell maize, that's where they go. But if there's something else in there, it sort of confuses their sense of smell, and a lot of them will just fly on. Okay? We know this from long experience in Central America because we've had fall armyworm there for 50 years, well, hundreds of years. Okay, another little thing you can do, I'll just tell you, this doesn't have to do with green manure cover crops, but if you take a very small pinch of lime or a certain amount of ashes from your kitchen, and you go along and you look at the maize plants when they're about this high. Okay, if they have holes across the leaves, that means the insect is inside the plant. Okay, if they have 3 or 4 holes going across the maize leaf, then that means the insect is inside. So you drop the very small amount of lime or the ash in the top of the maize plant, and that will kill them. Then you do it again. You have to do it twice. Do it again when the plant's about this high, and that's it. After that, even if the insect attacks the plant, it won't do enough damage to affect your yield. Okay? So, but yes, there are a number of insects. An agricultural school in Honduras did a study of mucuna to find out how much the presence of mucuna in the maize field affected insects, and it did reduce the incidence of insects quite significantly. Yeah, of several insects. Yeah.
Okay, again, thank you so much for your sharing.
It's quite all right.
Because your sharing is really particular for the farmers, especially in your region. So I have only not two questions, but I need some not questions, just to hear from you about the cover crops. In your experience, the farmers, what kind of type of cover crops did you find is very useful to the farmers? That is number one. Number two, we have seen with the maize and beans crop there. We've seen there was some more yellow sticks with the compost. 1 to maybe 1 to 3 and so on, so let's see. So I want to hear from you, from your experience again with farmers, because we need, it is a kind of sharing. It is a sharing from farmers. How did you really, all the strategy you use to produce a very useful, very good compost in your area?
Okay.
You see, in our context, if you talk to the farmers, please make a big compost that they produce very. They can use only the banana leaves they cut, only they do that, and at the end, they have no compost.
Yeah.
So we need to hear from you, from your experiences, how we can do the best with our farmers.
Okay, I'll answer your second question first, and that is with compost. There are quite a number of books that talk about how to make compost. most of the different ways that people make compost are quite good. You know, you use about half dry material, half green material. There should be at least some leguminous plants in there. The more leguminous plants, the better, because that'll mean more nitrogen. You know, the stack has to be quite large, because otherwise it won't heat up. The cold air from the outside will keep it from heating up, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, basically, a lot of those rules now, there are ways of making them a little better by putting worms in them, using what we call vermiculture. But the problem is that that's fine for a vegetable garden, but it's way too much work, because you have not only the making the stack, you have to turn it over, you have to keep it wet, you have to keep watering it, then you have to carry it out to the field, and then you have to spread it clear across the field. None of that do you have to do with green manures. The green manures are already growing in the field, and they're already spread out across the field. All you have to do is cut them down. You know, so it's, you don't, you know. Furthermore, if everybody in the village is making composts, or making quite a bit of compost, you're not going to leave anything out there for the animals to eat. Compost rots or improves your organic matter. Green manures produce new organic matter. So you aren't taking anything away from the animals. You're producing new organic matter, and in huge quantities, much larger quantities than you could ever do with compost. So that's now, what was the first? Oh yeah, which species? Okay, we'll get into that this afternoon, but very quickly. Usually we start out with jack bean. It's by far the best. Here's some seed. We use a bushy jack bean, not the climbing one that you'll find in the forest. Yeah, pass the seeds around, maybe. The jack bean, we use that first because it's very resistant to poor soils, and it's very resistant to drought, okay? So it's the one that will grow even in the worst of conditions presently. Okay, it's not edible. So we explain to farmers you'll only have to use this for 2 or 3 years, and then we'll try something that's edible. The second one that I most like is lablab beans. It's highly nutritious. Like I said, you can also eat the leaves. It grows easily through a 6-month dry season, but it does require a fairly decent soil and a fairly decent amount of water the first 3 or 4 months. That's why we try to grow the jack bean first. It also improves the soil tremendously. By the way, the jack bean fixes 240 kilos of nitrogen per hectare, which is, like I say, about 6 times what you would ever need for a good maize crop here. The lablab produces well, somewhere around 120 to 140. I've seen different figures. And of course, if you have a lousy soil, each of these will produce a little less. That's the maximum. The third thing that we like to use is Glycidia trees, because this will reduce the amount of sunlight that hits your crops. Now, if you grow maize, I'm very well aware that if you grow maize under a mango tree, it'll die because you have too much shade. What we want is somewhere between about a 20 to 50% shade. If we do that, our maize will actually grow better. If you look around your field where there's a tree that doesn't have too many leaves on it, you'll see that usually under those trees, the maize is growing better than it does out in the sun. Right? Okay. Your maize will produce 20 to 30% more just being under a light shade. And what we do with the Glycidia is we prune it. You can stand on the ground and prune it. You never have to climb the tree or anything. You prune it standing on the ground. And so we prune it once a year, and that way we have the amount of shade we want. Okay, the fourth species that I would probably most recommend is a 9-month, like the one in the picture, anywhere from a 9-month to a 2-year cowpea. Now, these are not common. I didn't even know they existed until 3 years ago. But now we found some in Madagascar. We found some in western Tanzania. And I just 3 weeks ago found some of these same year-long cowpeas in eastern Zimbabwe. So there are places where they exist. I'm not sure if there's any more places than that. I'd never seen them before 3 years ago. But anyway, these cowpeas will last until the following year. So like I said, we have green leaves on the ground when we plant our crops. And they, as you could see in that photo, they do a wonderful job of increasing yields, and they do a wonderful job. Even though cowpea doesn't produce as much biomass as some of the others, it does a wonderful job of creating, after about 6 years, almost total resistance to drought. Okay? Thank you. Okay. These black ones here have a little white hilum on them. Did you pass these around?
I have it. Roland has a presentation after lunch.
Yeah, okay.
So, and this
And we'll
is
show them.
to be outside. Please, when you go outside, you can do the shopping over there.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's important because there is also a lot of junk bean in Rwanda. And what is junk? Junk. He was asking, oh, please, comment quickly.
This is jack bean, this is the lablab, and this is, I'm not even sure what that is because it looks, pardon? Is it? You're sure? Oh, okay. That's what's called pigeon pea. In French, it's probably gandoul, or, oh no, it's poicongo.
Lablab and pigeon pea. So getting in touch with Brian, my colleague Brian, and Gabriel. Yeah, for more information. Thank you.
Okay, and I should also say pigeon pea should definitely be among those best ones because it is quite resistant to drought. It's quite the pigeon pea, which in French is what? Gandu? Guandu? Something like that? Oh no, it's poicongo or pois. They have different names. Huh? Okay. Yeah. Okay, pois cajan it's called here. Okay. Okay, it is wonderful for about 5 reasons. First of all, it's very resistant to drought. Not as good as the jack bean, but almost. Secondly, it's resistant to very poor soils. I've planted on pure sand and it does quite well. Third, it
Subsoil.
easily,
Subsoils. It goes down to this.
yeah,
Carry on.
okay. Third, it easily grows into the dry season, and if we leave it and don't kill it when we harvest it, it will grow right on into the next season and produce leaves soon after the rains start again. So you cut it off about this high, what we call ratoon it, after we've planted our next maize crop, and then it will produce all sorts of leaves and everything. And the fourth thing is a result of that. It'll grow for 4 years if we just ratoon it each year, if we cut it off. The beauty of that is that means that it has at least 1 year and sometimes 2 and 3 years of root growth, which means it's like a tree. The trees don't die in droughts. In the second, third, and fourth year, the pigeon pea is almost totally resistant to droughts, which means 3 out of 4 years you can be sure you get a crop. Okay, even if the drought is so bad it kills your maize and it kills your beans and kills everything else, you're going to have pigeon peas. Okay?
Let's give a hand to Roland for his presentation. He'll be presenting